So I want you to try a little thought experiment with us. Just, imagine walking down your local high street right now.
Right. Like wherever you happen to live.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't really matter if you are in London or Chicago, Sydney, or just some mid-sized provincial town.
Yeah.
You can probably picture the exact layout perfectly in your head.
You know where everything is. The coffee shop, the bakery.
Right. You can probably, smell the exhaust from the traffic or maybe catch that scent of the bakery on the corner. You hear the specific hum of the conversations as people walk by.
The local accent, the rhythm of it all.
Exactly. You look around at the faces of your neighbors, the shop owners putting out their signs, the people waiting at the bus stop, checking their phones. You just have this innate, almost subconscious understanding of the social rhythm of the place.
It feels like home, essentially.
It does. Now, I want you to take that mental image, hold it in your mind, and just fast forward 40 years.
Oh, wow. Okay. 40 years.
Yeah, we're stepping right into the 2060s. Now look around that exact same physical spot. What does it actually look like?
That's a really tough thing to visualize.
Right. Are the faces you see, the languages you hear, the cultural rhythms of that street, are they just a continuation of the world you know today?
Or is it something else entirely?
Exactly. Are you looking at something entirely new, something fundamentally detached from the past century of that town's history?
It is a really profound thought experiment, I think, because it exposes a very specific psychological blind spot that we all share.
A blind spot? How do you mean?
Well, we have this deep-seated cognitive bias, right, where we just tend to assume that tomorrow will look roughly like today.
Oh, sure, just with better tech.
Exactly. Sleeker smartphones, more advanced software, maybe faster cars. We assume cultural and demographic continuity.
Right, we think the people will be the same, just with cooler gadgets.
Yeah, but demography, which is, the mathematical study of human populations, birth rates, death rates, migration, it doesn't operate on that kind of linear, predictable comfort.
That's not a straight line.
Not at all. Demography moves incredibly slowly. I mean, almost imperceptibly on a day-to-day basis. And then, seemingly all at once, it hits this tipping point.
Then just reshapes everything.
Yeah, it reaches a tipping point that completely reshapes the foundational architecture of a society.
And that concept, that sudden, overwhelming structural reshaping of a society, that is the engine driving our deep dive today.
It really is the core of it.
Because today, we are exploring a massive, deeply provocative, and frankly, highly debated source. We're looking at a transcript of an extensive, really in-depth interview broadcast on the GB News YouTube channel.
Right, the long one.
Yeah, and the guest is this prominent demographer, someone who has spent their entire career just analyzing the hard mathematics of human populations.
And specifically focusing on the rapidly changing demographics of modern Britain.
Exactly. So our mission today is to unpack the underlying mathematics of the population change that he presents. But, beyond just the spreadsheets and the census data,
There's a lot of data.
there's so much data. But beyond that, we are going to explore the deeply philosophical and highly controversial arguments about national identity, the economics of fertility, and the cultural impacts of mass immigration that he argues are downstream of all those numbers.
Yeah, but before we delve into his timeline and his data, I really need to establish a very clear framework for you, the listener.
Please do, because this is heavy stuff.
It is. We are wading into some highly complex, historically fraught waters today. The source material we're examining contains heavily politically charged content.
Very charged.
Right. It directly addresses state immigration policies, the really sensitive concepts of race and ethnicity, cultural assimilation, and, the very definition of what constitutes a national identity.
Which are basically the third rails of modern politics.
Exactly. In the modern political arena, these are incredibly sensitive, highly polarized topics. They provoke intense emotional reactions across the entire political spectrum.
Totally understandable why, too.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So let me make our position here absolutely clear. The purpose of this deep dive is not to endorse the political views or the cultural anxieties presented by this demographer.
Right. Nor is our purpose to condemn them or, act as moral arbiters.
Exactly. We are not taking a side in the geopolitical arena today.
We are just acting purely as your analytical guides. We're taking the machinery of his argument apart to see how the gears turn.
That is the perfect way to frame it. We are here to impartially decode the arguments being made.
Just laying out the pieces.
Right. We want to analyze the underlying logic the demographer relies upon, lay bare the specific data points he cites, and really help you understand the core foundational ideas that are driving one side of this massive global political debate.
We're basically dissecting the anatomy of a specific worldview.
Exactly. Because whether you find his conclusions deeply resonant or fundamentally objectionable, understanding how this argument is structured is just crucial for navigating the modern political landscape.
Yeah, knowledge is most valuable when you actually understand it from the inside out.
And that requires examining perspectives objectively, without immediate judgment.
Okay, so looking at the architecture of the argument, to understand the future that this demographer is predicting for that high street in the 2060s, he argues we first have to look backward.
Right, we have to start with the history.
We have to understand his specific reading of historical data, because in the interview, he establishes this very deliberate timeline, and he marks one particular year as a massive, irreversible turning point in British history.
He calls it year zero.
Year zero, and that year is 1997.
Yeah, so the year zero concept is basically the bedrock upon which his entire thesis rests.
Okay, lay it out for us.
The demographer structures British demographic history by arguing that for roughly 1,000 years, so stretching from the Norman conquest in 1066 all the way to the end of the Second World War in 1945, the demographics of Britain remained overwhelmingly structurally consistent.
Consistent in what way?
In his terminology, he states the population was overwhelmingly and uninterruptedly white British. He's establishing a baseline of profound historical continuity.
Okay, I really need to challenge that historical framing right out of the gate, because history is just rarely that neat, right?
Sco is always messy.
Britain is an island, yes, but it isn't an isolated biodome. I mean, didn't people migrate and trade and invade during that entire 1,000-year span?
They absolutely did.
Right. The Anglo-Saxons fundamentally rewrote the cultural DNA of the island. They gave us the very roots of the English language.
The Anglo-Saxons were a massive shift.
And then you have the Norman conquest in 1066, which he mentions. The Normans crossed the Channel, built these massive stone castles to enforce their rule, completely replaced the existing aristocracy.
They changed everything from the top down.
Exactly. They fundamentally changed the legal system, land ownership, the language of power. So doesn't that historical reality suggest that Britain has actually always been in a state of profound cultural and demographic flux, rather than this static, unchanging monolith he describes?
It's a really valid critique, and the tension between cultural evolution and demographic replacement is a huge point of historical debate.
So how does he address it?
Well, the demographer does actually address this in the interview. His defense of the year zero concept relies on separating political or cultural conquest from sheer demographic mathematics.
Okay, so separating the rulers from the numbers.
Right. He points to modern DNA analysis, which suggests that while the Anglo-Saxons were culturally dominant, the underlying pre-Roman British DNA remained heavily present in the population.
The genes didn't completely flip, even if the culture did.
Exactly. But his main counterargument regarding the Normans is really about scale. The Normans were politically and culturally enormous, as you noted, but demographically,
They were tiny.
they were a tiny elite. We're talking about a few thousand individuals of Scandinavian and French extraction ruling over a population of a few million.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, so they didn't mathematically replace the population, they subjugated it from the top down.
So he's drawing a hard line between a change in management, so to speak, and a change in the actual workforce.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. He argues that previous historical migrations, whether it was the Lombards arriving as bankers or the small Jewish communities arriving after the Norman conquest, or later the Huguenots.
The Huguenots were Protestant refugees from France, right?
Yes, fleeing persecution. He argues all of those groups were demographically insignificant. We are talking about thousands or perhaps tens of thousands of people integrating into a population of millions over the course of centuries.
So it's a drop in the ocean over a long time.
Right. They might have altered the cultural flavor, but they didn't fundamentally alter the demographic pie chart of the nation.
He had his point.
His argument is that the current wave of migration is mathematically unique in British history because it is a mass demographic shift from the bottom up, not an elite political replacement from the top down.
Okay, that brings us to the mid-20th century, which is usually where people point to the beginning of modern British diversity, right?
Yes, the post-war era.
Because after World War II, Britain actively invited people from its empire to help rebuild. We have the famous Windrush generation arriving from the Caribbean, and the beginning of South Asian immigration.
People coming to work in the textile mills in the north of England, for example.
Right, or later fleeing persecution in places like Uganda and Kenya. So that wasn't thousands, that was a lot more.
It was. And the source acknowledges this mid-century period, but again, he focuses strictly on the mathematics of scale.
The raw number.
Exactly. He notes that while this post-war immigration was highly controversial and socially disruptive at the time, he explicitly mentions the political scarring caused by figures like Enoch Powell.
And for our global listeners who might not know that name, Enoch Powell was a mid-century British politician. He gave these highly inflammatory anti-immigration speeches in the late 1960s that just permanently altered and polarized British political discourse.
Yes, the Rivers of Blood speech. Powell became a symbol of severe native resistance to those early migratory waves.
Right.
But the demographer points out that despite the massive political friction Powell represented, from a purely mathematical standpoint, the numbers arriving during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s were still relatively small compared to the total indigenous population.
So the pie chart still hadn't flipped.
Not at all. The source highlights that even after several decades of this post-war immigration, by the time the 1991 census was conducted, Britain was still well over 90% white British.
Over 90% in 1991. Wow.
Yes. So the demographic baseline, in his view, remained fundamentally intact.
Which brings us back to 1997. If the country is still over 90% homogenous in 1991, what specifically happens in 1997 to earn this dramatic title of Year Zero?
So 1997 marks the election of Tony Blair's new Labour government.
Okay, a big political shift.
Huge. According to the source, this is the precise moment where state policy shifted and the sheer volume of immigration began to fundamentally accelerate.
It went from a trickle to a stream.
He argues it transitioned from being slow, manageable, and culturally absorbable to a deliberate, steady, and much heavier flow.
But wait, he also says that the Blair-era acceleration kind of pales in comparison to what's happening right now, doesn't he?
Oh, absolutely. He stresses that the sheer velocity of what we are witnessing right now is on a completely different level.
The post-COVID numbers.
He describes the current era as the Boris Priti wave.
Referencing former Prime Minister Boris Johnson and former Home Secretary Priti Patel.
Right. They oversaw this post-Brexit immigration system that essentially issued an unprecedented number of work and study visas.
Unprecedented, like how?
The statistic the demographer highlights to illustrate this velocity is just staggering. He says it's approximately 4 million people arriving in just a 5-year window.
Wait, really? 4 million in 5 years?
4 million in 5 years.
Let's try to visualize the mechanics of a societal shift that rapid, because I think the human brain really struggles with numbers at that scale.
It's hard to picture.
It is. It's like, okay, imagine looking at a massive historic building. For 1,000 years, the maintenance involved, swapping out a single brick here, maybe replacing a window there.
Very slow, gradual upkeep.
Right. The structure stood, the aesthetic evolved slightly, but the foundation was completely undisturbed. What he is describing in 1997 is a decision to start replacing entire walls.
A major renovation.
Yeah, but the last 5 years, the 4 million arrivals, that is the equivalent of attempting to dig up and replace the entire concrete foundation of the skyscraper over a single weekend.
While people are still inside it.
Exactly, while the people are still living and working in the offices above. The sheer mechanical stress of that rapid replacement alters the structural integrity of the entire building.
The structural stress of velocity. That is the exact anxiety he is articulating. It is the unprecedented, historically unique speed of the change.
It's the speed, not just the numbers.
Yes. And to prove that this isn't just an abstract anxiety, he points to the projections for the near future.
Okay, what do the projections say?
Well, we established that in 1991, the white British population was north of 90%. Today, according to the official data he references, it is dipping below 80% nationally.
Okay, so a 10% drop over roughly 30 years.
Right. But he draws attention to the trajectory modeled by Oxford demographers. He specifically cites the work of David Coleman and political scientist Matt Goodwin.
What are their models forecasting?
Their models forecast that, depending on the persistence of these current immigration levels, the white British demographic will fall below 50%, meaning the historical indigenous majority will become a minority in the country sometime by the 2060s.
By the 2060s. Wow. That circles us right back to our opening thought experiment.
Yeah.
Walking down that high street 40 years from now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the demographer argues that you don't even have to wait until the 2060s to see the reality of those projections.
You can see it now.
He says you just have to look at the leading demographic indicators today. He highlights a very specific, startling local statistic from the interview.
Lay it on me.
If you look at the demographics of primary school children in inner London right now, less than 20% are white British.
Less than 20% in the primary schools.
Less than 20%. And his analytical point is that the primary school population of today mathematically dictates the adult population of tomorrow.
That makes sense. They grew up.
Right. So London, he states, has already fully transitioned into a majority-minority city, and he views London as the demographic vanguard for the rest of the nation. What happens there happens everywhere else eventually.
Okay, so if we pause here and just look at this from a bird's eye view, it raises a profound philosophical question for you to consider about how human beings experience societal evolution.
It really does.
Is it the mere fact that demographic change happens that causes political friction? Or is it the unprecedented speed of it?
The velocity aspect.
Right, because if the demographic composition of that high street changed over the course of, say, 300 years, slowly phasing through generations, would anyone actually notice or feel a sense of loss?
Probably not. It would be too slow to feel.
Exactly. But because it is happening within a single human lifetime, within a matter of mere decades, does that velocity inevitably fracture the social contract? Because people feel the ground shifting beneath their feet just too quickly to adapt.
I think the pace of change, outstripping society's psychological capacity to process it, is a huge part of his argument. The friction of speed.
Yeah, speed causes friction.
However, the source argues that the mathematics, the sheer numbers and the velocity, they're only half of the equation.
There's more.
He insists that who is moving into the society matters just as much, if not more, than how many.
Okay, so the cultural background.
Exactly. It's not just about the volume of the arrivals, but the cultural distance of the arrivals. And that brings us to the absolute core of his critique regarding how the modern political class views integration and assimilation.
And he pulls absolutely no punches when it comes to the political establishment.
No, he goes right after them.
He essentially accuses politicians across the mainstream spectrum of willful blindness, or worse, deep apathy.
He does.
To give our global listeners some context, he specifically calls out two figures in UK politics. First, he mentions Richard Tice, a prominent figure in the Populist Reform UK party. And when Tice was reportedly asked if it matters that the white British population will become a minority, he allegedly responded with the dismissive, "I'll be dead by then."
Which is quite a statement.
It really is. And then he also brings up Sajid Javid, who is a former senior conservative government minister. Javid apparently responded to concerns about rapid demographic change with a blunt, "So what?"
And the demographer vehemently rejects both of these political postures. He views them as symptomatic of a deep societal decay.
So how does he analyze the "I'll be dead by then" mindset? Because that sounds pretty cynical.
He analyzes it as the ultimate expression of modern, hyper-individualistic nihilism.
Nihilism, wow.
Yeah, to him, that statement signifies the complete death of any national consciousness. It represents the total abandonment of the idea that an individual citizen is merely one link in a much longer, ongoing chain of historical tradition, cultural heritage, and even genetic continuity.
It's like severing the chain.
Exactly. It is a worldview that loudly declares that society only holds value for the 70 or 80 years the individual is alive to consume it. Once they're gone, the fate of the nation is completely irrelevant.
It's the ultimate "after me the deluge" mentality.
Precisely.
And what about the "so what" mindset from Sajid Javid? How does he parse that?
He argues the "so what" mindset is rooted in a very specific economic and sociological fallacy that he just deeply despises. He calls it the concept of the fungible human.
The fungible human. Okay, let's define fungible, because that's a term usually reserved for commodities trading, not, human sociology.
Right. In economics, a fungible good is an asset that is completely interchangeable with another asset of the same type.
Like oil.
Exactly. A barrel of crude oil is fungible. A ton of steel is fungible. A US dollar is fungible.
It doesn't matter where the oil was extracted or where the dollar was printed. They function exactly the same way in the machine of the economy.
Exactly. A dollar is a dollar. The demographer argues that modern politicians, heavily influenced by neoliberal economic theory, have essentially begun to treat human beings as fungible units of economic output.
So the assumption of the politician saying "so what" is that human beings are essentially interchangeable cogs in the economic machine.
Precisely. The underlying unspoken assumption of mass economic immigration is that you can take an individual from anywhere in the world, airlift them out of their native culture, drop them into the British economy, and they will seamlessly, almost magically integrate.
Just plug and play.
Yeah, plug and play. The assumption is that they will automatically adopt English values, historical perspectives, and liberal social norms, simply by virtue of living within the geographic borders of the UK.
While simultaneously filling a labor shortage and paying taxes, of course.
Of course, that's the economic imperative.
So he is arguing that the spreadsheet ignores the soul, for lack of a better word. He argues that people aren't just blank slates waiting to be overwritten by the local culture the second they step off the plane.
Exactly. He asserts that the cultural software people are running is radically different depending on where they originate.
The cultural software. I like that analogy.
He points out that different regions of the world have fundamentally incompatible views on, say, the role of religion in public life,
Right.
or the value of the individual versus the obedience owed to the collective, and crucially, vastly different views on the rights, roles, and freedoms of women in society.
And his point is that Western Europe went through centuries of very specific, highly bloody historical crucibles to arrive at its current cultural software, right?
Yes, that's exactly it. He argues that the liberal, secular, democratic norms of the West are not the default setting of humanity.
They weren't just stumbled upon.
No, they are the specific product of the Enlightenment, the Reformation, and the Industrial Revolution.
So it took a lot of work to get here.
A lot of work and a lot of time. He finds the political idea that people arriving from cultures that did not experience those specific historical transformations will simply instantly morph into modern, liberal English people just because they crossed a border to be, in his own words, obviously absurd.
Okay, here is where I really need to interrogate the premise of his argument.
Go for it.
Because the demographer makes a very deliberate distinction between skin color and cultural software. And he actually uses his own family history to make the point, which I found fascinating.
It is a really interesting part of the interview.
He notes that his parents were German Jewish refugees who fled to Britain. And he compares their successful integration experience to that of the Afro-Caribbean immigrants of the mid-20th century Windrush generation.
Right, two very different demographic groups.
Exactly. He argues that both groups, despite vastly different origins and physical appearances, successfully assimilated into the British fabric. Why? Because they possessed what he calls cultural touchstones.
He is establishing that successful assimilation requires a pre-existing bridge between the immigrant and the host.
Right. He argues his parents learned the language quickly and looked broadly European, allowing them to blend in. The Afro-Caribbean immigrants, while presenting a different physical appearance to the native population, shared a deep cultural bridge.
What was the bridge there?
Well, they spoke the English language fluently. They had a long, albeit complex, historical affinity with the institutions of the British Empire. And crucially, they were largely practicing Christians in a nation that was historically built on Christian norms.
Okay, so he uses those two historical examples to build a theoretical framework for what makes assimilation possible.
Yes, what does he call it?
We can synthesize it into what we'll call his three elements of immigration.
Okay, let's hear the three elements.
If a nation wants immigration to function without fracturing the underlying society, he argues you need all three of these elements to be present. First, sheer demography.
Meaning the absolute numbers.
Right. The absolute numbers of arrivals must be small enough that the host culture is not physically overwhelmed.
Okay, that's element one.
Second, what he terms contiguous cultures. The arriving populations must have some degree of significant cultural similarity or overlap with the host nation, whether that is a shared religion, a shared language, or a shared historical narrative.
So the bridge we were just talking about.
Exactly. And third, and this is crucial for him, the host country itself must possess a robust, unwavering sense of its own national identity. It must know exactly what it is asking the new arrivals to assimilate into.
Okay, I understand his three elements, but I really have to push back on his deep skepticism of modern assimilation.
What's your counter-argument?
Is he vastly underestimating the sheer, overwhelming gravitational pull of modern Western culture?
In what sense?
Let's grant him the premise that the first generation arrives with fundamentally different cultural software. What about their children and their grandchildren?
The second and third generation.
Right. They grow up in the local schools, they drink tea, they complain about the rain, they listen to the same pop music, they absorb liberal democratic values through sheer osmosis in the culture.
The melting pot theory.
Exactly. Is he ignoring the power of a modern, highly interconnected, multi-ethnic society to synthesize a new, shared, hybrid identity over multiple generations? Does it really matter where the starting line was if the finish line is shared?
That is the classic argument for the melting pot, yeah.
Oh, duh.
But the demographer's counter to that optimism lies firmly in his third element.
The host country's census self.
Yes. He would argue that your optimistic scenario relies on the host culture actively and proudly transmitting its values to the next generation. But he claims that Britain, and much of the Western world, currently suffers from an ideological mind virus.
A mind virus. That's a strong term.
A mind virus of deep self-criticism.
Oh, I see. He's referring to the modern cultural movement of, like, decolonizing histories and focusing on historical sins.
Precisely. He argues that Western societies have become hyper-focused on self-flagellation regarding their imperial pasts, their historical injustices, and their traditional institutions.
We're constantly apologizing for the past.
Right. And his analytical point is this. If a society's dominant institutions, its universities, its media, its political class, are constantly telling the native population and the new arrivals that the nation's history is purely shameful, its culture is inherently oppressive, and its foundations are illegitimate.
Then what exactly is it asking the immigrants to integrate into?
Exactly his point.
You can't ask someone to assimilate into a void. Or worse, ask them to assimilate into a culture that tells them they should despise the culture they're joining.
Right. If the host culture lacks pride, lacks a coherent, positive narrative of its own historical value, he argues that assimilation doesn't just stall, it becomes impossible.
Because there's nothing to anchor to.
Exactly. And when you combine a self-loathing host culture with massive demographic numbers and arriving populations that possess deep cultural distance, you don't get a melting pot.
What do you get?
You get balkanization. You get parallel societies sharing a geography, but holding no shared identity whatsoever.
To drive this point home, he steps outside the Western European context and uses a fascinating international thought experiment, doesn't he?
He does, and it's a very effective rhetorical device.
He asks us to look at how the rest of the globe views national identity.
Yeah, he asks you to imagine traveling to Japan.
Okay, picture being in Tokyo.
Right, imagine standing in Tokyo and telling the local Japanese population that in 50 or 100 years, ethnic Japanese people will be a small minority in their own ancestral homeland.
They wouldn't like that.
And then tell them that the people living there will perhaps speak Japanese, but they will practice entirely different religions, possess radically different cultural traditions, revere different historical figures, and look physically entirely different. And then channel that British politician we mentioned earlier, and imagine telling the Japanese public, but don't worry, you'll be dead by then, so it really shouldn't matter to you.
Oh, wow. They would look at you like you were utterly deranged. They would view that as an existential threat to their civilization.
He then extends the analogy. He says, imagine going to Tunisia, or really any nation in the global south, and telling them their country will soon be overwhelmingly populated by people from a completely different continent with a different religion.
And suggesting they shouldn't care because humans are fungible economic units.
Exactly. His point is that non-Western nations across the globe would vehemently and likely violently reject the idea of passively losing their ethnic and cultural majorities.
Because they view it differently.
They view historical, ethnic, and cultural continuity not as a form of bigotry, but as the fundamental, undeniable right of a sovereign nation.
It really forces you to examine the baseline assumptions of Western political thought. It forces you to ask why the West is the outlier here.
And that is exactly the question he poses to the listener. Why is it that only Western liberal democracies have adopted this unique worldview?
The worldview that wanting to stay the same is somehow bad.
Right. Why is it that desiring your country to be populated by the descendants of your ancestors and wishing to maintain a contiguous historical culture is somehow pathologized? Why is it considered abhorrent or outside the bounds of polite society only in the West?
This is where we need to connect directly with you, the listener, because this strikes at the very core of how you define your place in the world.
It's a huge question of identity.
How do you define national identity? Is your identity as a citizen of your country based purely on shared civic values?
Meaning just the rules of the road.
Right. Is it just a shared belief in democracy, the rule of law, the Constitution, and the act of paying taxes? Meaning anyone who agrees to those rules is instantly as British or American or Canadian as anyone else.
That's the civic definition.
Or is national identity fundamentally, inextricably tied to something deeper and older? Is it tied to historical continuity, a shared ancestry, a specific cultural and religious lineage, as this demographer claims?
It's the ultimate tension between a modern civic nationalism based on ideas and a traditional ethnocultural nationalism based on history and blood.
And that debate between the civic and the ethnocultural is basically the invisible high-voltage current running beneath almost every major political headline, election, and social fracture we see today.
It's everywhere once you look for it. But, if we shift gears here, we find that the source's profound anxiety isn't just rooted in abstract philosophical ideas about culture and historical memory.
It gets much more practical.
Much more. His argument is deeply structurally tied to cold, hard economics, the mathematics of birth, and the realities of human aging.
Let's follow the money and the math. Because the politicians who shrug and say, so what, to massive demographic change, they aren't just doing it out of a philosophical belief in open borders.
No, they have a very pragmatic reason.
They rely on a very specific, highly pragmatic, and widely accepted economic argument. The standard narrative we hear repeated constantly by think tanks and governments is this: our native Western populations are getting older.
People are living longer.
Right. Medical science means people are living significantly longer, and simultaneously, native citizens are not having enough babies to replace themselves.
So we have a shrinking tax base.
Exactly. We have a shrinking tax base and massive labor shortages, particularly in the vital sectors of healthcare, social care, and agriculture.
The jobs that keep society running.
Therefore, the argument goes, we must bring in millions of immigrants to work those essential jobs, to pay the taxes necessary to fund the state, and to physically care for the ballooning elderly population.
It sounds perfectly logical on paper.
It sounds like mathematical necessity. The interview even highlights a specific UK government program to illustrate this, a health and social care visa.
Oh, right, the visa program.
Yeah, it was originally projected to bring in maybe 40,000 workers, and it ended up ballooning to an astonishing 650,000 arrivals.
And the political establishment and the corporate sector, they view those 650,000 people as a crucial economic fix.
An injection of human capital.
Exactly. They view it as a necessary injection to keep the gears of the economy turning. The demographer, however, looks at that exact same number, looks at the demographic models, and calls the entire system a Ponzi scheme.
A Ponzi scheme. That is a devastatingly heavy accusation to level at the foundational economic strategy of the modern state.
It's a massive claim.
And just to be clear for everyone, a Ponzi scheme is a fraudulent financial structure where early investors are paid off not by actual profit, but by the capital injected by a constant stream of new investors.
Like a pyramid scheme.
Exactly. It requires a continually expanding, exponentially larger base of new money to keep the entire illusion from collapsing under its own weight. So how does he take a concept of financial fraud and apply it to the demographics of a nation?
This is where the demographer provides an incredible analytical breakdown of the data. And it hinges on clarifying a crucial demographic distinction that is frequently and sometimes deliberately conflated in media reports.
Okay, what's the distinction?
It's the mathematical difference between the fertility rate and the birth rate.
Okay, let's ensure we understand these terms perfectly because the entire Ponzi scheme argument relies on them.
Right. So the fertility rate is a measure of individual behavior. It represents the average number of children born to a woman over the course of her lifetime.
Okay, so it's on an individual basis.
Yes. In developed nations, the demographic replacement rate, which is the number of children needed just to keep the population perfectly stable, accounting for infant mortality without relying on any integration, is roughly 2.1 children per woman.
2.1 to break even, got it.
Now, the birth rate, on the other hand, is a macro-level measure. It is the overall number of live births per 1,000 people in a total population over a given year.
Okay, so fertility rate is about how big individual families are, and birth rate is about the total volume of babies being produced in the society as a whole at any given moment.
Precisely. Now, if we look at the common pro-immigration economic argument, it relies heavily on the assumption that immigrants from the developing world have much higher fertility rates than native citizens.
Meaning they have way bigger families.
Right, and therefore, their large families will perpetually boost the shrinking tax base. But the demographer points out that while this was historically true, it is largely a myth today.
A myth. Really?
He cites extensive data demonstrating that when immigrants from the developing world arrive in developed Western nations, their fertility rates plummet to match the native averages incredibly quickly.
They adapt to the local birth rates.
Yes. He notes this rapid assimilation of family sizes has been documented with Latino populations in the United States and South Asian populations in the UK.
Why does it drop so fast?
Because within a generation, they face the exact same economic pressures as the natives. The high cost of living, expensive housing, childcare costs. And so they end up having 1 or 2 children. They do not maintain a fertility rate of 4 or 5.
But wait, if they are only having 1 or 2 kids, how are they changing the demographics so rapidly, and why does he call it a Ponzi scheme? Where's the illusion?
The illusion lies in when they arrive in their life cycle.
Where they arrive.
Think about it. Immigrants overwhelmingly arrive in a new country when they are young, usually in their 20s and early 30s at the peak of their working and reproductive years.
Right, you don't see massive waves of 80-year-old immigrants arriving.
Exactly.
Right.
So while their individual fertility rate, the children per woman, is low and dropping, their overall birth rate as a demographic group is temporarily massive.
Because there's just so many of them in that childbearing age bracket.
Exactly. This massive influx of young people creates what demographers call demographic momentum. They form a massive, sudden bulge at the very bottom of the population pyramid.
Let's visualize that pyramid. You have this heavy base of young, working, tax-paying immigrants at the bottom who are actively supporting the smaller, aging native population sitting at the top of the pyramid.
That's the setup.
And from a politician's perspective, looking at a 10-year budget window, that looks like a brilliantly solved problem.
And it does work beautifully for about 30 or 40 years.
Yeah.
The tax coffers are full, the care homes are staffed. But here's the exact mechanism of the demographic Ponzi scheme. Time doesn't stop.
They get older.
Those young immigrant workers do not stay young forever. Eventually, they grow old, they retire, and they require pensions and intense health care themselves.
Oh, I see where this is going.
And because they only have 1 or 2 children themselves, matching the native fertility rate, they have not created a large enough succeeding generation to support them in their old age.
So the structural flaw reveals itself. Suddenly, the top of the pyramid isn't just heavy, it's crushing.
It becomes incredibly top-heavy.
Because now the society has to support the remaining elderly native population and the newly elderly immigrant population using a tax base of children that wasn't large enough to support either of them.
The pyramid effectively inverts. You have created an exponentially larger elderly demographic that now requires an even more massive, unprecedented wave of young immigrants from abroad just to support it.
Just to keep it from toppling over.
It is a structural addiction. You have to keep bringing in ever larger, constantly expanding cohorts of young people from other nations just to keep the economic support ratio from collapsing.
What happens if it stops?
If the influx ever slows down, or if the developing world stops providing young workers, the entire economic system, the state pensions, the healthcare systems, the elderly care infrastructure, collapses entirely under its own debt.
Wow.
That is why he calls it a demographic Ponzi scheme. It doesn't actually solve the fundamental problem of an aging society. It merely kicks the can down the road, magnifying the scale of the crisis for the next generation to deal with.
That mathematical reality is terrifying. It means we aren't actually solving a problem. We're just taking out a high-interest payday loan against the future.
That's a perfect analogy.
But there is another layer to this economic argument that the demographer introduces, and it shifts the conversation from mathematics to profound global morality.
This is a really fascinating part.
He introduces a concept coined by the economist Philip Pilkington. He calls it biological imperialism.
Biological imperialism. This is a concept that fundamentally upends how we view the ethics of global labor migration.
It truly does. To illustrate biological imperialism, the source uses a striking, almost unbelievable real-world example. He claims that currently there are more Ghanaian-born health workers practicing their profession in Britain than there are practicing inside the borders of Ghana itself.
Just let that sink in for a moment.
It's insane. We in the wealthy West look at our aging population, our low native birth rates, and our massive labor shortages in hospitals, and we say the pragmatic solution is to recruit trained nurses and doctors from the developing world.
And crucially, that recruitment is framed domestically by politicians and hospital administrators as a triumph of multicultural diversity, open borders, and economic efficiency. It is presented as a moral good.
Like we're doing everyone a favor.
Right. But the demographer demands that we look at it from the perspective of Ghana.
Right.
He argues that Ghana, a developing nation with its own severe public health challenges, expended immense national resources to bring that individual into the world. They fed them, they provided primary and secondary schooling, and then they invested heavily to educate them to the elite level of a medical professional.
That represents a massive investment of developing world capital.
And just when that individual is fully trained and ready to return that vital investment to their own community, to treat their own sick citizens, the wealthy West swoops in.
We offer a higher salary, a stronger currency.
And we simply extract that fully formed human asset. He views this extraction as an act of profound arrogance and moral bankruptcy on the part of the West. It is colonialism dressed up as progressive policy.
It forces a deeply uncomfortable moral paradox onto you, the listener.
It really does.
Because the political left and the corporate right often champion mass immigration either as a humanitarian act or a free market necessity. But is the West's structural systemic reliance on economic immigration actually a form of modern biological extraction?
That's the question.
Are we essentially strip mining the vital human capital of the developing world simply because we in the West are too comfortable, too economically squeezed, or too focused on our individual careers to endure the financial and personal sacrifice of raising our own children to fill those necessary roles?
Are we just outsourcing the hard work of making humans?
Exactly. Are we temporarily solving our own demographic winter by actively causing a catastrophic brain drain and a healthcare crisis in the global South?
That is the damning essence of the biological imperialism critique. It suggests that the supposedly pragmatic economic fix of mass immigration is not only mathematically flawed as a Ponzi scheme, but it is ethically indefensible when viewed on a global scale.
It's a really harsh mirror to look into.
We are outsourcing the arduous, expensive task of raising humans to poorer nations and then harvesting the results.
Okay, if we accept his premise that legal economic visa immigration is mathematically a Ponzi scheme and morally an extractive practice, we have to ask how he views the other side of the coin.
Which is?
Undocumented or illegal migration, because that is a distinctly different demographic phenomenon.
It is entirely different.
And exploring this leads us directly into what is undeniably the most volatile, controversial, and publicly anxiety-inducing segment of his analysis: the dangerous intersection of youth, gender, and societal instability.
Yeah, the interview tackles the issue of undocumented arrivals head-on. Specifically, the phenomenon of small boats crossing the English Channel, which just completely dominates UK headlines.
Right, it's constantly on the news.
Now, the demographer is careful to acknowledge right away that in terms of sheer demography, the raw mathematical numbers, this undocumented group is significantly smaller than the millions arriving legally via state-sanctioned work and study visas.
It's a fraction of the total number.
However, he argues that despite the smaller numbers, this specific group is the source of profound, intense societal alarm among the native population.
And why is that?
He believes that alarm is not based on irrational bigotry, but is entirely justified based on the specific demographic profile of the arrivals.
Okay, let's break down that profile. Who exactly is he analyzing here?
He describes the profile of these undocumented arrivals as being heavily, overwhelmingly concentrated in a specific demographic. They are predominantly young, they are overwhelmingly male, often described in security parlance as being of fighting age, and they originate almost exclusively from deeply unstable, economically collapsed, or war-torn regions of the world.
So young, male, and from conflict zones.
Furthermore, he argues that many of these young men arrive carrying cultural software that is not just different from the host nation, but is potentially deeply antagonistic to Western, liberal, secular, and particularly feminist lifestyles.
This is the exact point where political rhetoric usually bursts into flames, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's incredibly contentious.
Yeah. But what I found interesting is the source attempts to ground this cultural fear in a specific sociological theory. He draws from arguments he made in his book, Tomorrow's People.
Right, the Barcelona analogy.
Yes, he uses a historical analogy to explain the mechanics of societal volatility, and he uses two different historical versions of the exact same city, Barcelona.
The Barcelona analogy is an elegant way to understand his theory on why societies explode into violence. He asks the listener to examine the demographic makeup of Barcelona during the 1930s.
Which was the era documented by George Orwell in Homage to Catalonia. Right?
Exactly. The prelude to the Spanish Civil War, a time of intense, bloody factionalism.
So what did Barcelona look like then?
The demographer points out the crucial demographic reality of Barcelona in the 1930s. It was an incredibly young society.
Yeah.
The median age of the population was in the early 20s.
Early 20s, wow.
It was a city overflowing with youthful energy, deeply radicalized by competing ideologies, full of organized anarchists, communists, and fascists.
A total powder keg.
It was a highly combustible environment, and that raw, youthful demographic energy eventually ignited, fueling the horrific mass violence of the Spanish Civil War.
The equation he presents is simple. A young society is inherently a volatile society.
Right. And he then contrasts that 1930s powder keg with the modern reality of Barcelona and the broader Catalonia region.
Oh, because of the recent independence protests.
Exactly. Just a few years ago, there were massive, deeply felt political tensions regarding Catalan independence from Spain. There were millions marching in the streets, unauthorized referendums, police crackdowns, political leaders fleeing into exile.
It looked like things were going to spiral out of control.
The ideological ingredients for mass violence and civil war were seemingly all present on the table. But it did not ignite. The protests remained largely peaceful, and the system held.
Why?
Because modern Barcelona is demographically old. The median age in Spain today is drifting upward toward 50 years old. He paints a very evocative sociological picture to explain the peace. Instead of thousands of angry young men with nothing to lose taking up arms and building barricades, you have a population composed largely of 50-year-olds.
And what are they doing?
They are sipping espresso in cafes, they are deeply worried about paying their mortgages, and they are exhausted from looking after their elderly parents.
They just don't have the energy for a civil war.
The demographer argues that older societies are almost universally, predictably peaceful. They fundamentally prioritize stability, comfort, and the status quo over the chaos of revolution.
So the source is arguing that demography, specifically the median age of a group, acts as the master thermostat for the political temperature of a society.
Theft thermostat, yes.
Old societies are tired, risk-averse, and peaceful. Young societies are energetic, risk-seeking, and inherently combustible. But I have to push back on his application of this theory to modern immigration.
Where's the flaw?
Is he being dangerously deterministic here? He is essentially arguing that if you bring in a concentrated demographic of young men from different cultural backgrounds, you are mathematically importing the necessary ingredients for, as he quotes another thinker, David Betts, civil war scenarios.
That is a stark warning.
But that feels like a massive leap. Can't a demographic group be young, energetic, and culturally diverse without being inevitably doomed to violence? Isn't he completely ignoring the millions of young immigrants who undertake these perilous journeys simply because they want to work hard, send money home, and build a quiet, prosperous life?
It is a vital pushback, and a very fair one. The source is not arguing that violence is an absolute, unavoidable certainty in every individual case, nor is he saying every young immigrant is a latent revolutionary.
Okay, so what is he saying?
He is arguing about the laws of probability at a massive societal level.
Yeah.
He points out a deeply alarming demographic friction that is currently building across Western Europe.
Right.
You have a host population, the indigenous majority, that is rapidly shrinking in size and rapidly aging.
The espresso-sipping 50-year-olds who desire quiet stability.
Exactly. Simultaneously, sharing the exact same geographic space, you have a growing, heavily concentrated minority population that is incredibly young. And in the specific case of undocumented arrivals, they are disproportionately male, often economically marginalized, and originating from conflict zones where violence is a normalized tool of dispute resolution.
So he is arguing the danger isn't just youth, it's the stark contrast. You have a massive age, energy, and cultural gap between the shrinking, tired majority and the growing, restless minority.
Exactly. And his severe warning is that the prevailing liberal consensus, the optimistic belief that everyone, regardless of age, background, or economic status, will just naturally get along and quietly assimilate into bourgeois middle-class norms, is dangerously naive when you mix those specific volatile demographic ingredients.
You're just asking for trouble, in his view.
He argues that combining a tired, aging, culturally self-critical host culture with a massive influx of young, restless male energy from cultures that possess entirely different views on authority, religion, and gender creates a highly flammable social environment.
It's a genuinely terrifying prognosis for the future of European cities, and it really forces you to view the nightly news through a completely different lens.
It changes the context entirely.
When you see political anxiety, sudden riots, or localized friction on the streets of London, Paris, or Dublin, How much of that is truly driven by the stated political ideology of the day? And how much is simply the inevitable, raw physical friction of this demographic age gap?
Just physics, essentially.
Right, the shrinking, aging majority feeling physically and culturally overwhelmed by the energy of a growing young minority.
That underlying demographic friction is the unspoken subtext of so much modern political anxiety in the West. But, this analysis brings us to the ultimate unavoidable question.
Yes, the what now question.
Exactly. We have spent this deep dive detailing the demographer's critiques. If he truly believes that mass immigration is mathematically a Ponzi scheme that will collapse, if he believes it is morally extractive to the developing world, and if he believes it is socially explosive and risks importing civil conflict, what on earth is his proposed alternative?
Right. If he is screaming that the ship is sinking and the current lifeboats are actually anchors, what is his solution?
We have to find an answer.
To find the answer, the interview moves abruptly away from the macro level of geopolitics, border control, and national identity, and dives into the deeply personal, intimate, and financially terrifying realm of the family.
We are talking about the movement known as pronatalism.
Yes. The demographer argues that the only true sustainable escape route from the demographic trap is for the indigenous populations of the West to dramatically increase their birth rates. They must start having children again.
To illustrate the scale of the crisis, he points out a stark, uncompromising statistic. Britain's native fertility rate has fallen to roughly 1.4 children per woman.
1.4. And as we established when discussing the math earlier, a society requires a fertility rate of 2.1 just to maintain a stable population.
Just to tread water.
Exactly. A rate of 1.4 isn't just a slight dip, it is a demographic death spiral. Functionally, a rate that low means every succeeding generation is significantly smaller than the last.
It compounds negatively.
It means in 50 years, you have half the tax base trying to support twice the number of retirees.
It is a massive, accelerating contraction of the society. Therefore, he advocates for a radical shift in state policy, calling for a new pronatalism of the 2030s.
A new pronatalism, what does that mean?
Well, he is very careful to distinguish his modern vision from traditionalist reactionary politics. He states explicitly that this is not a conservative crusade about forcing women out of the workplace and back into the kitchen.
So it's not a return to the 1950s.
Not at all. He argues that modern low fertility is not a moral failing of young people. It is a structural economic problem that requires radical, modern structural solutions.
So what exactly are the structural solutions? Because let me tell you, anyone listening who is in their 20s or 30s knows exactly how this feels.
Oh, they feel it acutely.
How do you convince people to willingly take on the massive burden of having 2 or 3 children when absolutely everything, rent, groceries, energy, feels unbearably expensive and chaotic?
It feels impossible for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So he proposes revolutionizing the financial reality of young adulthood. He argues that currently, Western economies are entirely rigged to favor the old at the expense of the young.
Rigged for the old, okay.
To fix this, he suggests massive state interventions.
Mm-hmm.
First, addressing the housing crisis by whatever means necessary, so that young couples can actually afford to buy a family home in their 20s, rather than renting cramped apartments well into their 30s.
Which is the reality for almost everyone right now.
Second, introducing massive targeted tax breaks, specifically for young working families, to ease the financial penalty of having a child.
Make it cheaper to have kids.
And third, radically altering or even outright forgiving student debt, which currently acts as a massive financial anchor weighing down young adults the exact moment they enter the workforce.
Let's focus on the mechanics of that student debt point, because it perfectly illustrates the clash between the economic clock and the biological clock.
They are completely misaligned.
If you graduate at 22, saddled with massive debt, you spend the next decade funneling all your disposable income into loan repayments and exorbitant rent. By the time you finally pay off the debt, save a deposit, and buy a house, you are 32 or 35.
And you're exhausted.
You finally feel financially secure enough to start a family, but you have fundamentally delayed the biological window. You might have 1 child, but the biological and energetic window for having 3 children has largely closed. The debt structure mathematically enforces low fertility.
That is exactly the mechanism he is highlighting. The economic timeline is entirely out of sync with human biology, and to fund these massive interventions for the young, he suggests touching the absolute third rail of British politics.
What's the third rail?
He suggests lifting the triple lock on pensions.
Oh boy. We absolutely need to explain the triple lock for our global audience because it perfectly encapsulates his argument about intergenerational theft.
The triple lock is a UK government policy introduced to protect pensioners. It guarantees that the state pension will increase every single year by whatever number is highest out of three metrics: inflation, average earnings growth, or a flat 2.5%.
Which means, mathematically, the wealth of the elderly is guaranteed by the state to always grow, or at least be protected, even in years when the economy crashes and the wages of young working people are stagnating or falling behind inflation.
Precisely. The older generation is shielded from economic downturns, while the youth absorb the shock.
That's incredible.
The demographer views the triple lock as the ultimate symbol of a gerontocracy. He argues the state is continually borrowing vast sums of national wealth to funnel it toward the already secure elderly demographic.
And his solution?
His radical proposal is to break that lock, stop the generational wealth transfer to the old, and redirect that immense capital directly to the young to actively incentivize family formation.
It is a demand for a complete rebalancing of the economic scales. But he recognizes it's not just about throwing money at the problem, right? He also highlights the necessary cultural shifts required to boost fertility.
Yes, culture plays a massive role, too.
For instance, he takes aim at modern sex education in schools. He argues that the current curriculum is entirely focused on preventing teenage pregnancy and avoiding STDs.
Which are important.
While those are important public health goals, yeah, he argues the curriculum completely fails to educate young people about the unforgiving biological realities of human fertility.
It ignores the clock.
He wants the state to actively teach teenagers that female fertility drastically declines in one's 30s. His argument is that young people need this data so they can make informed, realistic life plans, rather than operating under the culturally reinforced illusion that they have unlimited time to start a family.
He also extends this cultural critique to the corporate workplace.
Oh, the corporate world definitely needs a critique here.
If a society wants highly educated, ambitious working women to have children, the corporate world must fundamentally change its structure. He suggests mandating greater workplace flexibility, specifically targeting parents for guaranteed work-from-home days, or heavily subsidizing corporate nurseries so that pursuing a career and having a family are not mutually exclusive, punishing choices.
It's a massive, holistic approach combining financial redistribution with deep cultural shifts. And to demonstrate what happens to a society if it fails to implement these structural changes, he brings in another powerful international comparison.
This is where we look at East Asia.
Right. He asks us to look at East Asia, specifically comparing the demographic trajectories of Japan and South Korea.
His analysis of East Asia provides a terrifying real-world laboratory for low fertility.
I found the analogy he uses here to be just brilliant. He compares low national fertility to the mechanics of taking on financial debt.
It makes the abstract numbers instantly relatable, doesn't it?
It really does. He says, look at Japan. Japan's fertility rate is very low, perhaps even slightly lower than Britain's current rate. But Japan has been running this demographic overdraft for decades.
So it's a slow burn.
Because their birth rate decline was a slow, steady, multi-generational slide, the society has had time to slowly adjust its infrastructure. The demographic debt is baked into their system, and while they are shrinking, they are managing the decline without totally collapsing.
It's painful, but manageable.
But then he says, look at South Korea.
South Korea presents a completely different catastrophic scenario. Their fertility rate has completely collapsed in a historic freefall.
It's the lowest in the world, right?
By far.
Yeah.
It is currently hovering well below 1.0 child per woman.
Wow. Under 1.0. Using his analogy, he says South Korea didn't run a slow overdraft. They just took out the demographic credit card and maxed it out to the absolute limit all at once in a single generation.
And the bill is coming due immediately.
And because the collapse of the birth rate was so sudden and so extreme, their societal structure hasn't had time to adapt at all. Their schools are emptying, their military is facing a massive manpower shortage, and the economic structure is buckling rapidly under the sudden lack of youth.
And what's truly fascinating here is his cultural analysis of why East Asia, and South Korea in particular, is struggling so profoundly with this demographic collapse.
Right. Why is it hitting them so hard?
He notes that South Korea and Japan lack a crucial cultural shock absorber that has historically existed in the West. He points to the absence of a foundational Abrahamic religious tradition, meaning the deep historical influence of Judaism, Christianity, or Islam.
How does religion play into the birth rate?
He argues that historically, the deep-seated cultural and moral values of these religious traditions, which heavily emphasize family and children as a divine blessing, act as a sort of cultural floor.
A floor, I see.
They act as a brake on how low a society's fertility can realistically plummet, even under extreme economic stress. East Asia, broadly speaking, lacks that specific cultural and religious floor.
So there's nothing stopping the free fall.
Exactly. Combine that lack of a cultural floor with intensely demanding, highly patriarchal corporate workplace norms that brutally punish educated women who decide to step back to become mothers. And the result is the South Korean fertility collapse.
Women simply refuse to participate in a system that demands they sacrifice absolutely everything.
Exactly. The South Korean example serves as his ultimate warning of what happens when the structural economic environment and the cultural environment become utterly hostile to the formation of the family. The society simply decides to stop reproducing.
So after unpacking all this, let me ask you, the listener, directly. Does this structural economic argument for pronatalism resonate with your lived experience?
Because it hits close to home for a lot of us.
When you look at your own life or observe the lives of people in their 20s and 30s around you, do those massive economic hurdles, the crushing decade-long weight of student debt, the utter impossibility of getting onto the housing ladder without inherited wealth, the eye-watering cost of childcare that rivals a second mortgage, do those feel like the real, unacknowledged birth control of our modern generation?
This is a very compelling way to look at it.
Is the Western demographic crisis, the lack of babies, truly just a downstream symptom of a hyper-capitalist economic system that has perversely made the most fundamental natural human act, having a family, financially ruinous?
It is a powerful reframing. It takes the deeply personal, private choice of whether or not to have a child and frames it as the ultimate downstream consequence of macroeconomic policy and state structure.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today, analyzing a worldview that challenges the foundational assumptions of modern Western politics. Let's do a rapid synthesis of everything we've unpacked from this source material.
Good idea.
We started with his core historical narrative. The idea that Britain and the West more broadly is undergoing an unprecedented, hyper-rapid demographic transformation, shifting from 1,000 years of relative historical homogeneity to a state of massive, velocity-driven change starting in the year zero of 1997.
We then examined his profound critique of the political class. We unpacked his argument that treating immigrants as fungible economic units ignores deep, historically forged cultural differences.
The cultural software.
Right. He posits that successful assimilation requires small numbers and, crucially, a host culture that is deeply proud of its own identity, rather than infected with a mind virus of self-criticism.
And then we got into the money.
We broke down his mathematical assertion that relying on mass immigration to fix an aging population is a demographic Ponzi scheme that merely delays and magnifies the crisis,
while simultaneously acting as a morally bankrupt biological imperialism that extracts the vital human capital of the developing world.
We explored his deeply uncomfortable, historically grounded theories about youth, volatility, and the Barcelona analogy.
The powder keg of a young population.
We examined his warning that the age and energy gap between a shrinking, tired native majority and a young, restless immigrant minority is a mathematical recipe for social combustion.
And finally, we laid out his radical alternative to the current system. A massive state-led restructuring of society, housing, taxation, and corporate culture to support a new pronatalism, hoping to pull Western society out of its terminal demographic overdraft before it hits a South Korean-style collapse.
Before we conclude, I want to briefly reiterate our impartiality disclaimer. The arguments, historical interpretations, and projections we have decoded today from the demographer's interview are deeply debated, fiercely contested, and highly polarized.
Very much so.
They reflect a broader, incredibly intense global conversation about the nature of borders, the preservation of historical identity, and the economic shape of our collective future. Our goal was simply to map the internal logic of the specific argument for you, providing you with the analytical tool to understand it.
And, as always, we want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over, something that builds on the foundation of the source material, but twists it in a completely new, perhaps unexpected direction.
The twist.
During the interview, the demographer very briefly mentions artificial intelligence, mostly in the context of needing lifelong education to adapt. But let's take that specific thread regarding AI and pull it hard. Let's look at the hidden assumption behind this entire debate.
This is where the entire paradigm of the conversation could fundamentally shift.
Think about the core underlying premise of this entire discussion. Both the pro-immigration politicians who want millions of visas and this pro-natalist demographer who wants natives to have 3 children base their entire existential panic on one unquestioned foundation:
And what's that?
the absolute requirement for a massive, constantly expanding base of human labor to care for the elderly and generate the tax revenue to run the economy.
We need workers.
But what if we are standing on the absolute precipice of an artificial general intelligence and physical robotics revolution that fundamentally, permanently breaks the historical link between human labor and economic output?
It's a staggering variable to introduce into the mix. If advanced AI systems and sophisticated physical robotics can automate millions of necessary jobs, from administrative logistics and supply chains to the physical demands of social care, elderly nursing, and agricultural harvesting, does that technological leap completely shatter the core premise of the demographic Ponzi scheme?
Exactly. If we don't actually need a massive expanding base of young human workers to physically and economically support the elderly population of tomorrow, because armies of robotic systems are doing the physical labor and highly taxed AI corporations are generating the national dividends, do both sides of this bitter political argument suddenly lose their entire foundation?
That's a wild thought.
Do the mass immigration advocates demanding labor and the extreme pronatalists demanding a baby boom suddenly find their core economic anxieties rendered entirely obsolete on the march of technology?
It's entirely possible.
Are we currently tearing our societies apart, arguing fiercely over 20th century demographic problems, while a 21st century technological tidal wave is about to make the whole debate completely irrelevant?
It is a profound, destabilizing question. It suggests that while demography has historically been destiny, technology might be about to rewrite the rules of the game entirely.
It is definitely something to think about the next time you walk down that high street and wonder what the future holds. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly deep dive. Keep questioning the numbers, keep examining the narratives beneath the headlines, and we will see you next time.